This is the third part of the texturing series that I started at the beginning of the year. A lot has changed in MD since then. We've had top stitching, which changes the workflow for Blender a lot. In this video, we'll be working in Blender pretty exclusively. We already created some clothing in MD in part 1, and we created some fabric in part 2 using Photoshop. We'll be bringing everything together to create some final renders in here in Blender. I'm not teaching you how to use Blender. First, I don't feel that I'm qualified, and second, it would be a really long video. You'll need some familiarity with Blender to understand what I'm going to show you. There are lots of other videos out there for learning Blender basics. I'm sure you can bring yourself up to speed pretty quickly with those. This is the setup that I like to use when I'm testing textures in Blender. I have the UV window over here and the 3D window in the center, and I have a tube, and this will look familiar. This is what we were creating in MD in part 1 of the series. And then I've got form-fitting clothing here with this tights and a skirt which has gathers in it. So this is a nice assortment to look at fabric and see how it's going to look in different circumstances. You'll see that I have the texture node editor open down here at the bottom. This is where we're going to be working quite a bit in this video. One thing I do want to point out, when I export out of MD, I export in multiple patterns. You can see that this is not all welded together. Every pattern is still separate. And that's the way I like it, because I like to apply different effects over here in Blender. Now my scene here is lit with an HDR. Let me render it and you can see. And I have it turned up pretty bright. And I like this kind of lighting because I'm not very good at setting up lights on my own. I do have the Pro Lighting Studio here that I like to use for my images, but I'm not going to use it in this video because most of you probably don't have it, and I don't want this to be something that you need. So just set up some lights if you're familiar with that kind of thing, or do the environmental lighting like I've got going here, just so you can have a good view of the fabrics as we're creating them. In part 1 of the series, I talked at length about maintaining scale and using these tubes over in MD. I do this so that you can use a common library for textures without having to change the size drastically over here in Blender. So let's start with one of the textures from part 2. And here's that simple flower. I've applied it to the tube, and it is over here on the leotard as well. So I'm going to zoom up here a little close so that you can see it. The tube is a really great test because it's large and it works well for making sure you don't have any tiling problems. You can see that the tile is very good, and because of the pattern offset on the fabric, you can't even really see where it tiles. We'll want to make sure the fabric is to scale on the leotard, and I've already played around with it, looking at it over here, and decided that the 0.05 scale is about the size that I want the flowers on the leotard. The interesting thing is that I was able to change the size of the fabric tile without messing with the UV maps. I did all of this down here in the node editor. This isn't the least bit complicated. We just have the 5 different nodes here, and we have here's the image, which is the flower image, hooked into the diffuse and out to the material. The magic is right here in the mapping node and the texture coordinates node. So we come out of the UV on texture coordinates into the vector of the mapping, and then that vector goes out to the image. So I just played with the scale here until I got it about the size that I wanted here on the leotard. If you recall from the prior videos, we talked about the fact that real fabric tiles are not square. And you can see, it's kind of hard to tell, but these are stretched. The flowers are not tiling properly to scale. So in order to fix this, we need to do a little bit of math. So here's a worksheet that I made because I'm lazy, and this gets really confusing. You enter the width and the height of the image that you're going to be using. And in this case, here's the little flower. It's 1211 pixels by 1640. And next you enter the approximate size you found in Blender. And as you recall, I liked the 0.05. I thought that was a good scale for the leotard. So then the formula calculates the percentage difference with the smallest number divided by the largest. And it figures out whether X or Y needs adjustment and puts it in the correct spot. You'll see that the Y stays 0.05, but X is going to change to 0.037. So I come over here to Blender, and in the X scale box, I just put the 0.037 and watch up in the screen and see how everything is perfectly proportional now. It took that not square image and it made it square basically when it tiled using the different figures in the X and the Y. And I'll put a link to the worksheet in the description so you don't have to redo all this yourself. It can get a little bit confusing, but once you have the worksheet, it's really easy. You just plug the numbers in and it does all the work. So now, knowing that percentage value, this fabric can be used on anything in Blender, and we know exactly what we need to do as far as scaling to put it in proportion, even though the tile itself is not square. And of course, the other advantage is now I can change from the 0.05 to anything I want, making the flowers larger or smaller, keeping them in proportion to each other, and use it on a variety of different clothing. Since we can do all of this with mapping, we really don't need to concern ourselves with the UV map that came over from MD. Now the only exception would be for alignment. So let me move this forward. Yikes, that's a little far. And you can see that this leotard is actually, there are 4 different pieces and they're sewn together down the center front. If you were going to be making this in the real world, you would make sure that when the patterns were laid out before cutting, that they shared the same line and it would just mirror over to the other side and everything would be in alignment. So we need to get this back in alignment. You can see there's like a pink flower running into a yellow flower over here. And so we will need to use the UV map to do that. All you need to do is select one of your pieces. I'm going to work with this one here on my left and switch over to edit mode. Select A for all, and you can see here is the UV map all lit up for us. We want to select G for grab and Y for locking it to the Y axis, and now I can move this up and down. So I'll locate the flower on the other side to get it lined up. That's about right. And now I'm going to select GX, and now I can move it over in the X axis, and there we go. Now it's aligned down the center front, and you can't even really tell that there's a seam there. With the fabric applied, it can be a little boring, so I wanted to add some texture and a little bit more life. Here's the new node network for the fabric, and here's the same flower up here at the top, the diffuse. I added a glossy and used a mix shader here. It's turned up a little bit high to give it just a little bit of shine. And then I've also added another mapping node and a new texture just for the knit fabric. So this is a knit bump that I like to use. It's something that looks really good, I think, on leotards. And so that's the image that's been applied down here. Now, what's really interesting, let me see if I can zoom up so you can see it. Hopefully you can see that there is a knit texture. That knit image is square. It's not a rectangle like the flower image was. And that's why we have a new mapping node down here just for that knit. Also, the scale on the knit is different because it's a different image. So I chose 0.002 for the scale. It's the same in X and Y because it is a square image. And then it just comes over here to the vector on the image, and I've got a multiply node and out to displacement. And here you can see how it looks. Now the other thing you'll take note of here is that I've created a different one for the binding that I've put along the edge of this leotard, and it's no different. You can see that we've still got the knit here. I don't have any kind of a image on it. It's just a solid color. Here you can see it close up. Now the top stitching is a new thing with version 7, and here's the top stitching node, material node. Again, I've got the same setup with just a simple diffuse and glossy into a mix shader. There's nothing fancy here at all, and that takes care of all the top stitching. So I can change the color of the top stitching to anything that I want, independent of the other items in the scene. And here's the final render that I did out of Blender. It's kind of far away, so you can't really see the knit, although it's just a feeling. You know that there is some texture going on here. I got rid of the skirt, so it's just the leotard. So now you're familiar with the steps to create fabric in Blender and how you deal with the non-square images that you use for textures. And you can use that technique to make a lot of really great fabrics in here. When I was creating fabrics off of real-world images, in addition to that not square tile issue, it didn't take long before I was having other issues, and the simple techniques that I've developed here just weren't working anymore. So I created a lace fabric from scratch that addresses some of the problems that I was running into, and we're going to go through it step by step so you'll know what to do as you start working with more complex fabrics. So here you can see the final render using the lace that I created, and there's a lot of things going on here. First, it is a lace fabric, and it has the net in the background. The second thing is that the shapes have glitter on them. These pink ones are full of glitter. And lastly, we have these other shapes that are just a solid color. If you've ever had the opportunity to see a fabric line card from a manufacturer, you'll notice that they'll make the same fabrics using different colors. And this is really common. When you make your own fabrics, you need to set them up so that they do the same thing. In addition to the 3 layers that we have going on here, we also need to be able to change the colors at will. And here's the same lace design, and see how different it looks now that it's in a different color. I also put a little bit more gloss on the band on this one. When you sell garments, there are going to be customers that absolutely love the brown and hate the blue, and vice versa. And that's why fabric manufacturers try to offer as many options as they can without redesigning everything every time. They just change the colors. So we're going to do the same thing, and in the process set up a library with basically infinite possibilities. I created the design for the lace using Illustrator, And I found an inspiration image on the net, and then I used it to draw this out. And there are two different layers here. I have the blue one and the black one. So once I was done with this, then I took it over to Photoshop. So here's that single image over here in Photoshop. And you can see that I used the same exact techniques over here that I introduced you to in the prior videos. I set up the rows and columns so that I could get one pattern repeat, and you can see it here. It's marked with the guidelines. So here's that single tile taken out of the other worksheet and brought over here so it's by itself. Again, we did this in the prior video. So we're going to do all the work that we need to do before it goes to Blender in here in Photoshop. So the first thing that I did was separate the blue and the black layers from each other. You can see that there are two different layers here. So for the blue layer, I put a black and white adjustment on it so that it's black. And I had left it blue because I needed to make the distinction between the two once I got over here to Photoshop. It's important to remember that we will be dealing with only black, white, and the alpha channel for transparency. You don't want any other colors when you're doing this type of layering that we're going to do in Blender. We want to be able to apply many different colors procedurally and not define them with the image at all. So I had my two layers, my color layer and my glitter layer, and the next thing I needed to do was create the net. And this is the net that I use. I've got a tile that then I can just repeat for whatever size I need. So here's my net. So the last thing I needed for this series was a bump map, and it will be applied to the glitter and the solid shapes. So this one is going to be a little bit strange looking. I need to have everything except the shapes transparent. And this will make a little bit more sense later when I show you how this comes together. But basically you can see that there's the shapes, both layers of shapes, and they have a little bit of texture to them. They're grayscale with a white background. They are not transparent. And then you can see that we have the net here. Ultimately, everything except the shapes and the net is transparent. And there's a really good reason for this, and I'll show you here in a moment. So here's the node network over in Blender for the lace. And I know it looks a little crazy, but it's really not that complicated, and I'll explain all the different parts to you and how they work. Now before we begin, I want to point this out right here. This is a glitter shader that I found over on BlendSwap. And here's the page over on BlendSwap. And I'll put a link to this down in the description so you can get it. It works really, really well for fabrics. And when I was doing all the real world imitation fabric, I used this thing a ton. So you might want to go ahead and get it. So now back to our fabric over here. The texture coordinate node and the mapping node you already know about. We've already discussed that. In this case, all the images are the same size. They're just different variations of the same image, so we can use the same mapping node throughout. And you'll note that the X and the Y are different on the scale. You'll recall that our image is not square. It's not even close to square. So that's why the scale is different. This top section is going to help us to set the solid color on the lace. And we have a diffuse and a glossy hooked into a mix shader, just like any simple fabric. And the image that's being used is the glitter shapes image. And you're probably thinking that that's totally wrong. We're setting the color Of the other shapes, these darker ones here, why would we be using the glitter image? And if we look over in Photoshop, that would be this image. So what we're doing is we're plugging that image into this mix shader over here, and we're using it as a factor. So we're saying everything that is transparent, we want it colored. And if it's not transparent, we want it black. The next image we're using is the color shapes, which if we look over here, that would be this one right here. And all it has is the transparent background and then those black shapes. This one is again plugged into a mixed shader as the factor. The two inputs are the color network that we just discussed and the glitter shader down here. So let's see what we have at this point. I'm going to disconnect the displacement and this and just go ahead and plug it right in. And now you can see what's going on. If we take a look at what we have at this point, you can see it's just a solid color background and the glitter shapes. So the next image that we have is going to be doing a lot of work. So we're using that image input as the factor. And what the mix shader is doing is saying we want everything that is not transparent in that image to be all of this that we've created up until this point. And everything that is transparent, we want it transparent. Here's the transparent BSDF. So let's take another look at this Photoshop image. I'm going to turn on the background. And now you have a really good idea. All this green is transparency. So we've just told Blender, if it is transparent, apply this transparent node. If it isn't, let everything we've done to this point come through. Now the last connection that we're going to make is displacement. It's using that same image texture, and this time we're hooked into the color because we're using it as a bump map, and I've got an inverter on it and a multiply node so that I can adjust the height. So that's the entire thing. Let's get a little bit of a close-up and I'll render it out so that you can see what's going on. So there's our net. Here's our color shapes, which we applied up here. There's our glitter. And then, of course, everything has a texture to it because of the displacement. Now, the tricky thing is that you just can't apply everything at once. You can't just pile images on top of each other. You really have to think it through. And that's especially true if you've got transparency, like lace. So now I'm going to show you what the advantage is of doing it the way that I have. I can go in here and change anything at will. Create a completely different look just by changing the node colors. And you can see how powerful that is. So you can adjust the scale also. Remember, we have that right here. So I'm going to bring up the worksheet again. So this is the way that the glitter is set right now. I've decided I wanted a 0.03 size, but I could just as easily take this down to, let's say, a 0.015 or 0.016. It gives me the numbers that I need to plug in. So I have a 0.016 on the X. .009 on the Y. And now I've got a lot more repeats in the fabric. So I'm going to switch this back because my computer is breathing pretty hard with all of this. And I'm going to just kind of freeze this here so that if you want to take a screenshot or you need to remember what we did, you can do that. So this is the entire node network here, all wired up. And let's review again the images that were used. This top one is the glitter, which would be this image. The next one is the solid color, which would be this image. The bottom one is working as displacement and our final transparency, and that would be this image. And I will turn the background on so you can see it clearly. So I hope you found this useful. Here I can show you the difference between the two colors. And I know it was a little bit confusing, but I think that if you create your own images and just do this one time following along with the video, that you'll figure out what's going on, and it will allow you to create lots of different fabrics. And you don't need to make lace fabrics. Even if you're applying different colors in different areas, some glitter over here or a solid over there, and you want to keep it so that you can change those colors in Blender instead of setting them with images, you'll use this very same technique. As always, thanks for watching.